These days, washing your hands several times a day is common practice, especially for those in the medical field. But in the 19th century, hand washing was such an unusual idea that the first guy who tried to convince doctors to wash their hands ended up being killed for it. Well, hello there. I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. In 1844, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis earned his medical degree and went on to specialize in obstetrics, which is the branch of medical science overseeing childbirth. 2 years later, Semmelweis was hired to be assistant to Professor Johann Klein in the first obstetrics clinic of the Vienna General Hospital. This was a teaching hospital, and Semmelweis' position of assistant to the professor was kind of what today we would call like a chief resident. He examined patients before Dr. Klein made his rounds, and even supervised difficult deliveries. And it wasn't long before Semmelweis noticed something very troubling. The maternal mortality rates were extremely high. Now, during this time, there were two separate birth wards, one that trained doctors and the other that trained midwives. Traditionally, midwives had always been the ones to assist mothers in giving birth, and they kind of just learned on the job. They didn't see any need for formal training because it was just seen as something that women knew about. However, somewhere around 1765, midwives started being formally trained, and around that same time period is when doctors also started being trained to attend births as well. And this was because many in the medical community thought it was about time that doctors started replacing midwives in the birthing rooms. They just felt that the advanced techniques that these doctors were being trained on would be an improvement over the traditional midwives. And Vienna General was a hospital where they trained both midwives and doctors. But what troubled Semmelweis the most was the vast contrast between the two wards. He noted that the physician-assisted births had mortality rates between 18 and 13%, whereas the mortality rates in the midwife ward was consistently around 2%. Being that Semmelweis was himself a doctor, it really puzzled him as to how this was possible. How were these old-fashioned midwives saving more lives than doctors with all their skilled training and fancy new techniques? Semmelweis was determined to get to the bottom of this and launched a full-fledged investigation into why physician-assisted childbirths resulted in more deaths. And what he discovered not only shocked him, but also led to his eventual demise. Now, Dr. Semmelweis wasn't the only one connecting the dots here. It was well known in the community at large that the 19th century hospital was not a great place to give birth. The primary cause of the high mortality rate in the maternity ward was a disease known as puerperal fever or childbed fever. This disease caused abdominal pain, fever, and delirium. Basically, it was a postpartum infection that would eventually lead to sepsis and death. Many expectant mothers called it the doctor's plague and were very reluctant to give birth at a hospital at all for fear that they would catch this disease and not make it out alive. Now, during this time, women who were willing to have their baby in the hospital were offered free care. The doctors really needed patients to practice on, and encouraging hospital births was also an attempt to put an end to a lot of the infanticide that they saw going on in those days. It was pretty common among prostitutes and the extremely poor who felt that they really couldn't take care of a child. And so while this could have been a mutually beneficial arrangement, many women were terrified of catching the doctor's plague and would rather give birth unassisted than risk that fate. During his time at the hospital, Semmelweis saw women who would come into the hospital wanting to have an assisted birth, but they would beg not to be sent to the doctor's ward, like on their knees begging, please send me to the midwives, not to the doctors. And he even witnessed some women choosing to give birth in the street or on the sidewalk rather than being sent behind what they saw as the doors of death. And wildly enough, giving birth to your baby in the street actually did have a lower mortality rate than giving birth in the doctor's clinic. I mean, yeah, I get it. Women had been giving birth for all of history, mostly just assisted by each other. And now that the medical community is involved, more people are dying rather than less. I can't say I blame these women at all. I probably would have been one of those weirdos taking my chances squatting in the streets too. We now have data that shows these women's claims were valid because 80% of women who contracted childbed fever did pass away from it. Dr. Semmelweis just could not stand by and watch this happen without doing something about it. And so he started collecting data surrounding these high mortality rates. And after a few years, the data supported his suspicions and the suspicions of everyone else outside the clinic, for that matter. Physician-assisted births led to higher mortality rates, and the same thing was happening in other hospitals all across America and Europe. Women were 20 times more likely to die while giving birth in the hospital versus giving birth at home. The mortality rates from home births during that time period were less than 1%. And when he compared mortality rates between the doctor's ward and the midwife's ward, the mortality rate in the doctor's ward was more than 5 times that of the midwife's ward. So Semmelweis started looking at the differences between the two clinics. At first, he thought that maybe it had something to do with how crowded the clinics were, but the midwife clinic was actually much more crowded than the doctor's ward. You know, everyone was begging to get in there. So that wasn't it. Then he observed that the midwives had women give birth on their sides, while the doctors had them do it on their backs. And so he had all of his students in the doctor's ward turn women over to give birth, and there was no difference. So the next thing he noted was that whenever a patient would die in the doctor's clinic, a priest would walk through the hospital ringing a loud bell. And so he kind of just thought, well, maybe the sound of the bell was so piercing and surprising that it put women into great distress and caused their hearts to stop. So he told the priest to stop ringing their bells. Obviously, that wasn't it. So is it the climate? Was it something to do with the shape of the buildings? Was it sunlight through the window? No, I'm telling you guys, this guy looked at everything. And some of these theories may sound ridiculous to us with the knowledge that we have today, but at the time, there were about 30 different accepted causes of childbed fever, ranging from people's own personal humors being bad, all the way to maybe the hospital delivery room was just too hot. You also have to remember that this was a time in medical history when they were just starting to get away from things being all about superstition, like maybe you got sick because your humors were too cool, which if you're not familiar with the concept of humors, this was considered to be a chemical system regulating human behavior, and it was thought to control your physical body as well. So a person having a cool humor meant they were very emotional or even irrational, which would cause you to be more susceptible to getting sick. Anyways, up until this point, that was something that had been believed for centuries, and around this time is when doctors really started to become trained to become scientists in order to help and learn more about their patients. They started really looking at physical data to try to figure out why things were the way they were, rather than just explaining it away or blaming everything on people's bad moods or some evil spirit or something that came in through the window, like a bad smell or something like that. So Dr. Semmelweis was going through this whole investigation more like a scientist. And so he was looking into any and all possibilities, no matter how crazy it might have seemed. And during this time, many of the more superstitious beliefs were still accepted as actual facts because they had not yet been disproven. And so this means that you really can't discount anything without testing it out first. But apparently, Semmelweis' obsession with solving the case of these dying mothers was really starting to get on his colleagues' nerves. His bosses had not hired him to be a medical detective. They hired him to be an assistant. Dang it. Semmelweis pushes on even though people were getting super annoyed with him. After coming to a dead end with all of the things that he tested before, Semmelweis started to theorize that maybe the student doctors were somehow bringing something to their patients since they were seeing all different kinds of patients. At this point, the frustration with Dr. Semmelweis was getting worse and worse. No one liked him running around changing their protocols all the time. And it got to the point that people were so frustrated that it nearly cost him his job. You see, this was before anyone even understood what a germ was, and so there was no infection control protocols or anything being done to stop the spread of infections because the medical community did not yet understand that you could spread infections in that way. Now, we've talked about this in previous videos, but a large part of how student doctors learned was by working on dead bodies, and because no one yet understood anything about germs, germs. Doctors didn't wear gloves. They also did not wash their hands. And they would go straight from handling dead bodies with their bare hands and walk straight over to the maternity ward and do a vaginal exam or catch a baby. So it seems like Dr. Semmelweis was putting together that maybe this had something to do with the whole situation. But being that he was driving all of his colleagues nuts with his relentless testing and getting very frustrated himself in the process, he decided to take a month off and go on vacation to clear his head. Once Dr. Semmelweis returned from vacation, tanned and refreshed to continue his work, he was confronted with the tragic news that a dear colleague had passed away. Dr. Jacob Kolichka had suffered a cut on his finger while performing an autopsy. But since he was working without any knowledge of germs or how infection was spread, Dr. Jacob had only grimaced and continued digging all around the dead body with his ungloved hand that had a fresh open wound. A few days later, his hand became infected. He developed a fever, became very sick, and died. Now, this was quite a common way for pathologists to die back in these days, so to everyone else, it was kind of a tragic yet not unexpected turn of events. But for Semmelweis, this was the light bulb moment he needed to bust this whole case wide open. Finally, it all clicked. This was the most obvious difference between the two wards. Midwives never did autopsies, so they weren't exposing themselves to cadaverous materials that they could then carry back to their pregnant patients. Since doctors and medical students were regularly working with dead bodies, Semmelweis theorized that maybe the doctors were bringing some of this cadaverous matter back with them on their hands. They were inadvertently exposing pregnant women to this cadaverous matter, and this was the cause of the childbed fever. Now, prior to this, it was always assumed that childbed fever was something that only women could catch after giving birth, but seeing that his colleague had all of the same symptoms that these women had prior to dying, Dr. Semmelweis started to theorize that Dr. Jacob must have exposed his bloodstream to something deadly within the cadaver's body. So even though he didn't fully understand why, Dr. Semmelweis felt that he was onto something and he wanted to test out his theory. His thinking was pretty straightforward. Putting your hands into a dead body makes them dirty. So before you put your hands into another patient, we should clean them. And to conduct his experiments, Semmelweis had medical students dip their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before delivering babies. Now, you might be wondering how he came up with this whole idea, and the reason was because of the smell. Rotting flesh smells bad, and often this would be on the doctor's hands still when they would come to deliver baby. And chlorinated lime was the best way to eliminate that smell from your hands. Now, this was similar logic to what we talked about in my episode on murder bottles, where we talked about how parents thought that if you could get rid of the bad smell from rotten milk, that it took away the risk to your health as well. And of course, that was not true, but Dr. Semmelweis was kind of under the same general type of understanding, and he got the idea of what to use by talking to the custodians that cleaned the hospital, and like their main goal, other than just removing big chunks of debris, was to actually get rid of the smell. And so that's how he decided what chemical to use. And luckily for him, chlorine is actually one of the strongest and safest disinfectants in the world, which is why it's so often used in swimming pools. So he tests out his theory by implementing this hand washing procedure for the maternity ward. I know, wild idea, right? Well, actually it was back in those days. During that time period, it was like the more blood and guts that you had on you, the better, because it made you look like you were a more experienced surgeon. Not only did they not wash their hands or wear their gloves or clean their aprons, they also did not disinfect their instruments. Probably just kind of wiped the large chunks on and moved on to the next patient. So Semmelweis has all of his students washing their hands in what's basically the 19th century equivalent of using a powerful bleach soap, and the results were immediate. The hand washing protocol worked. The death rate in the doctor's side of the hospital plummeted to 2%, which of course was much closer to the mortality rates in the midwife ward. So, yay! Everyone saw how brilliant he was and thousands of lives were saved, right? No. Doctors at that time did not take kindly to the insinuation that they were the ones causing the deaths of patients that they were working so hard to save. They also didn't like the insinuation that they could somehow be dirty, since back in those days, that was seen to be associated with your station in life, like poor people were dirty, not educated physicians. So despite his immediate success in the hand-washing trial in the birthing clinic, many doctors stood up in opposition to Semmelweis's theories. Professor Klein himself was one of Semmelweis's biggest critics, explained away the recent decrease in deaths in the doctor's ward by saying that it had to do with a recently installed ventilation system and nothing to do with washing hands. And the reason he believed this is because he subscribed to the miasma theory of disease, which said that diseases are produced due to unhealthy or polluted vapors rising from the ground. So basically, they thought that disease was caused by bad air. During this time, this was a widely accepted theory, which also explains why so many doctors believed that childbed fever could be caused by the room being too warm. But not only did Semmelweis's ideas go against all of the accepted norms of his day, he also wasn't the best at communicating his ideas. He was extremely passionate about saving lives, but he didn't consider how personal egos could get in the way of medical advancements. Clearly, that wasn't something that he personally struggled with. I mean, he went to the janitors and asked them for help, so I just don't think that he thought that way. And so it just didn't seem to even occur to him that someone would put their ego above the lives of their patients. But oh, was he wrong. On May 15th, 1850, Dr. Semmelweis gave a speech to the Vienna Medical Society detailing his findings. In addition to doctors not liking the insinuation that they were dirty or lower class, they also did not like the idea that the midwives might be doing a better job than the doctors, because this would completely upend Victorian social norms. One American obstetrician, Dr. Charles Meigs, openly mocked Semmelweis, saying, "Doctors are gentlemen, and a gentleman's hands are clean." Many physicians were offended by his findings and refused to wash their hands. Some even tried to sabotage his hand-washing regimen, which we'll talk about more in a bit. Semmelweis put his career on the line and provided concrete proof that washing hands and sanitizing tools decreased maternal mortality rates. But Victorian doctors were having none of it. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the medical community at large dismissed his findings. Washing their hands between every patient was simply too much work. Hospitals would have to be rebuilt and redesigned if they were going to have running water near every single hospital room. It also didn't help that several highly respected, very prominent doctors spoke out in opposition to Semmelweis's findings, essentially calling them nonsense. And of course, this made it where even more doctors rejected his theories without ever even giving them a chance. Young doctors who thought it sounded like a good idea would be ridiculed by their superiors, and so it was kind of like anyone who saw the logic in Semmelweis's ideas was bullied into sticking with the accepted norms of the time, which sadly sounds a bit familiar. When Semmelweis's 2-year term was due to be up, Professor Klein had another doctor quickly apply for Semmelweis's position and then hired that doctor instead of renewing Semmelweis's contract, essentially firing him. And of course, as soon as he left and his hand-washing protocols were not being implemented, mortality rates in the doctor's clinic rose right back to where they had been before. Now, I mentioned earlier that Semmelweis did not understand the how or why to his methods, and so even when doctors were open to his new ideas, they eventually ended up writing him off when he couldn't answer any of their questions. Especially when you had those doctors I mentioned earlier who were trying to sabotage his work. What they were doing is they were running their own tests to try to disprove Dr. Semmelweis's tests, but they weren't doing the tests accurately. Not only were they not using the right chemicals, they were just using soap and water, but they also weren't washing hands between patients. They were only washing their hands when they first entered the maternity ward, and then they were just seeing patients back to back to back without washing their hands in between. And so these doctors then spread their results, or lack thereof, as a way to prove that this whole hand-washing thing was basically bogus. Now, to make matters even worse, for some reason, Semmelweis didn't seem to try to discredit any of these other doctors' tests. He just continued to say that people needed to wash their hands. And he was extremely confrontational in the way that he spread this message. He started getting more and more angry and started basically calling all doctors who wouldn't listen to his ideas murderers, which in a way he wasn't wrong, but he really did not know how to persuade people. He could definitely have used a little honey. And because he couldn't effectively explain why or how hand washing would save lives, he was basically laughed out of the discussion and went even more on the offense, attacking his critics at every opportunity. He wrote harsh letters to other obstetricians, basically saying that if they wouldn't teach their students to wash their hands, that they were murderers and they were going to go down in history as having been the ones to cause childbed fever. After losing his job at Vienna General, Semmelweis attempted to find another job, but when he was rejected from other positions, he eventually moved back to his native country of Hungary with the ultimate goal of promoting hand washing in that country. In 1861, he finally published his studies and proposed hand washing to save women's lives. Of course, he also publicly named and attacked each and every one of his critics. Semmelweis was clearly very angry that no one would listen to him. He was convinced that hand washing would save lives, but no one seemed to care. I can't imagine how crazy he probably did feel. Like, you really think that you have such a simple answer to save lives and no one will listen to you and they act like you're a crazy lunatic. That probably would make you feel like you were actually going crazy. All of these doctors who were supposed to be saving lives were not willing to do something as simple as hand washing. It's no wonder that he was actually driven mad in the end. At least that's the claim. After he published his study, he continued to endure public scorn and rejection from his colleagues. He became depressed, started drinking heavily, and his actions started to become more and more erratic. His family and friends began to suspect that he was actually losing his mind. The theory was that he possibly was suffering from Alzheimer's disease or even syphilis. In 1865, Dr. Semmelweis had a colleague who asked him to come to a mental institution in order to consult on a patient. Once inside the hospital, Semmelweis realized too late that it was a trap and they intended to admit him to the hospital. When he tried to escape, he was placed in a straitjacket and beaten badly by the guards. 2 weeks later, he passed away from an infection that is believed to have come from a wound he received when the guards had beat him, either on the first day or the days following his confinement. He was only 47 years old. The miasma theory of disease continued to be accepted until Louis Pasteur came along in the 1860s and developed the modern germ theory by demonstrating the existence of disease-spreading germs. Of course, he was then followed by Lister, who took the ideas even further and developed such protocols as sterilizing surgical instruments and using antiseptics for surgery. These scientists' ability to actually explain their theories meant the entire medical landscape changed by the late 1800s. Pasteur, Lister, and other germ theory pioneers provided evidence of germs and how they spread infection. Suddenly, the missing piece of the Semmelweis puzzle fell into place. It became clear that physicians were spreading bacteria from postmortem bodies to their living patients. The germ theory took hold and miasma went out the window. Once this theory was firmly established, hand washing became the norm. Sadly for Semmelweis, he was about a decade ahead of his time. While he is still not as widely known as those who came after him, Semmelweis is finally recognized and celebrated for his contribution to modern hygiene. Now, he wasn't the very first doctor to ever suggest hand washing to stop the spread of infection, but he is undoubtedly one of the most important, as he was the first to make it his life mission to implement hand washing. There are now several universities and medical institutions bearing his name. There's even a phrase named after him. The Semmelweis reflex is a phrase that labels a person's tendency to reject new evidence or new knowledge because it contradicts established norms or beliefs. His work and dedication to saving lives through basic hygiene will live on forever. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and you'll stick around to listen to some more. And until next time, I'll catch you right here in the next one.